Andreas, thanks for joining us here. So talk to me a little bit about this rise of non-state actors in war.
Yeah. So, the last book that I've published on surrogate warfare is looking exactly at the assemblage between state and non-state actors. Rather than looking at war through the lens of it being entirely only state actors fighting each other, what we see today, particularly in the MENA region, is that different state actors enter into these kind of relationships with non-state actors, where some of these relationships are actually on par. So it's no longer this proxy relationship whereby the state is the patron and the non-state actors is somewhat the surrogate or the executive agent. We see also non-state actors externalizing the burden of warfare to other non-state actors. So you have these networks that are now fighting each other. They become very, very complex and makes it very, very difficult to control these conflicts. I mean, Libya is a great example, for example, where you have a variety of different state actors from outside of Libya getting inside of Libya, but not directly, but through surrogates. So you have, the Egyptians and the Emiratis in particular on one side, supported by the French, Turkey on the other side, supporting the government. And then on the ground, even the Haftar side, which is itself a surrogate, is already delegating to other surrogates or other militia groups that they're cooperating with. So these are networks where, in comparison to traditional conventional ways of looking at war, you have these very complex relationships of accountability and loyalty as well, which makes it very, very difficult, if not impossible, to control or predict what outcome is going to be of any of these conflicts. And the complexity of it means also that the international law that we have in place, which only looks at states by majority, makes it almost impossible for international law to be applied, because surrogates are a way to bypass international law, international humanitarian law as well. And for the most part, it has created a situation whereby most state actors that are extra-regional, so in Europe or in the United States, are looking onto these conflicts and can't do anything or unwilling to do anything.
Yeah.
And if they do something, and we've seen that with the United States, they also engage in surrogate warfare rather than doing it themselves, because they're risk averse, because they're trying to avoid being dragged in lengthy conflicts. So, the relationship between the United States and the Kurds, for example, if we look at the relationship of the Americans with the Kurds in Syria, what we see as well is that America wanted to be involved in Syria without getting directly involved, without being dragged into another lengthy war such as Afghanistan or Iraq, because nobody in America has any stomach for these kind of operations. Plus, the national interests are not as high or as urgent for them to provide a prerequisite for actually getting involved. So that what they do is they go and look at the surface of the conflict, at the various groups that are fighting each other, and then you decide which one can we actually work with. And they decided for the Kurds because they seem to be somewhat aligned with Western values, particularly and only in the war against ISIS, which was a sub-conflict of the wider Syria conflict. So surrogate wars are never the panacea or the silver bullet to actually solve these conflicts. They allow you to get involved and stay involved for an indefinite time without too much risk or too many costs. And the problem with that is you create protracted conflicts. And that's what we see in the MENA region, is protracted conflicts wherever you look. Because in the end of the day, it's one surrogate fighting another surrogate, and then people switch sides.
So tell me a little bit about one thing that you mentioned there. We talk about being able to bypass law.
Yeah.
From my understanding, it's pretty tricky to be able to predict the stability of war crimes, but also the humanitarian crises that come from these conflicts as well. Is that a fear?
Absolutely. So surrogate warfare is also a way to externalize war crimes. So you can basically, almost as if you would use a mercenary, you can outsource war crimes, because it gives you a level of discretion and deniability on the side of the patron to say we have nothing to do with it. We see that with the Iranians. The Iranians are the masters of surrogate warfare in the region, despite the fact that we know that many of these actors that are acting on behalf of Iran are actually almost Iranian, because they're staffed with Iranians. The Iranian government can always say, well, we have nothing to do with that. We don't control these people. And whatever they do, they do. If they commit war crimes, it's a shame, but we have nothing to do with it, when in reality they are being controlled by the government. So there are a lot of problems. There are problems when it comes to international law in terms of the sovereignty principle. When you have a surrogate intervening in another place, it doesn't really violate international law, because it's not a state crossing the border of another state. So you can meddle inside. And again, we've seen the Iranians do this, we see the Americans do this, we see the Russians doing it with mercenary groups in Libya and in Syria. And the range of surrogates that you have to your availability non-state actors, traditional militia groups or insurgency groups, but also private military or security companies that are working on behalf of states, Technology is another surrogate. So, we use drones, we can use artificial intelligence in the information space to kind of externalize to technological surrogates. So it becomes a very complex assemblage of different actors that are competing in a never-ending spiral of violence.
So the final question I want to ask you is about the use of narrative in surrogate warfare. Talk me through your perspective on this.
Right, so a completely new field that has emerged over the last couple of years, particularly with social media being such an important part of civil society across the world, is that you see patrons externalizing a lot of information warfare or subversion to cyber surrogates, bots, trolls, online influencers, who are part of these disinformation networks that have only one goal, and which is information psychological stability, targeting information psychological stability of communities. And the big issue here is that these are means of warfare that are not recognized as such. When we talk about fake news and disinformation, we see them as disruptive, but what we don't do is we don't really see them as means of war. What disinformation networks can do, they can actually, in target audiences, change their wills, their behavior, their attitude. Behavior is the ultimate one that you want to change. Yeah. And when you look at the definition of war, it's usually a competition of wills, a contest of wills. And if you don't know, you no longer have to contest wills, when what you can do is actually undermine the will of your adversary. So it is a means of war that we see the Russians using in America in their involvement in the US presidential election. We see that in the Gulf crisis with the Emiratis in particular, but also the Saudis, trying to change narratives about Qatar, trying to isolate Qatar diplomatically in the Western world, but also obviously the Emiratis trying to change how Arab communities are looking on the ground at problems. So in Egypt, they engage very much with the anti-Morsi movement and try to steer up polarization there. In Libya, they're doing it by investing into groups that are against the current government, against Islamists, and through disinformation have created a fake consensus and fake mobilization, which in reality, the source is fake, the mobilization is real, mass mobilization that can topple governments. And I think that is something that, looking forward, is very, very, very dangerous, and we have absolutely no way of actually controlling this, because it's entirely legal, particularly in the Western world where we cherish freedom of speech and liberal debate. How are we going to control debate when external actors such as Russia or the UAE or also China are trying to meddle in our information psychological complex of how we make decisions?
Petrifying.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Andreas. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.